Hello and welcome back to the June 1st podcast. My name is Ethan Moriarty, and I'd like to thank you for coming and tuning in. To start off this podcast, I'd like to say, please check out our social media pages. First off, our YouTube channel, June 1st, with the first spelt out. Our Twitter, June 1st WX. And my personal handle, at @eMoriartyWX. Now we're going to get into the show. Joining me today is none other than our first in-person guest, who is my brother, Connor Moriarty, fellow storm chaser, my chase partner, and overall great guy. Connor, welcome aboard.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Yeah, so Connor and I, we've known each other for quite an extended period of time, I'd say.
Oh wait, hold on. You can't see me, but I'm counting the number of years I've lived on my fingers. So
I would hope that you wouldn't have to do that on your fingers, but
it's comedy.
Yeah, okay. So Connor's been my chase partner for the better half of the past 4 chase seasons. 2018 was the first time we were really together chasing.
Yeah, so 4 years. Yeah, 18, 19, 20, 21.
Okay, so yeah. And Connor serves as the driver of our little chase team here. And boy, there's no other person that I would rather have behind the wheel of a vehicle when it comes to chasing storms. This kid has gotten us out of some pretty sticky situations. One of which is one that I detailed on the first episode, the pilot episode of the June 1st podcast, which I gotta stop saying Have you been noticing that? When you listen to the podcast, how many times I say
A little, yeah. I mean, that's just you.
Yeah. Well, from here on out, I'm going to try to minimize it as much as possible.
I mean, we can do like the tornado trackers and just like substitute interjections. Just different like or no, I just said or like
it'd be like
or something like that.
Yeah, I don't know. Those filler words. I just got to be able to string more complete thoughts together, I think. Anyway, our first chase together was May 15th, 2018, which was detailed on the first episode of the podcast, the pilot episode. And we encountered some pretty significant weather. It was a moderate risk issued by the Storm Prediction Center. The moderate is the second highest it can go on the scale, which is kind of counterintuitive when you think about it, because moderate, when you think of the word moderate,
seems to be more in the middle.
Yeah, you would think it would be a middle situation. There was a good article, or I believe it was actually more of like a capstone project about it by Alex Forbes, I believe his name is. He's now a meteorologist out of Georgia. He went to Mississippi State, I'm pretty sure. But he did his capstone project not too long ago. This is maybe a year or two ago now that he's graduated and an actual TV meteorologist now, on what the public perception was on what the SPC outlook was, which is interesting because I feel like people outside of the weather community don't really understand storm prediction outlooks.
I'm not sure if they really understand the Storm Prediction Center altogether.
Yeah, that's a good point. They're not really they're not the first public entity that you really see when it comes to reporting severe weather threats. I feel like that usually nowadays in 2021 comes from like the weather app or your, I don't know, local broadcast station probably, right?
Yeah, your weather station of choice and or weather channel of choice.
Interesting.
As in like AccuWeather or the Weather Channel.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense.
But all those stem from the National Weather Service, and not many people realize that.
I mean, they do their own forecasting to their degree. Like, I know AccuWeather is somewhat notorious for their long-range forecasts that seem kind of outlandish, especially to those that are actually in the community and understand what it takes to forecast that long in advance. But National Weather Service offices, they're like premier operational meteorologists and, you know, the best in the business. Obviously, they're doing this kind of stuff for the government, I guess you could say. It's a government entity. So you would expect that the best meteorologists, best forecasters are going to be the people manning these offices across the country. And the Storm Prediction Center in general, very talented mesoscale forecasters. So it would, personally to me, make more sense if they were more of a public entity. And I think the National Weather Service, just because of the lack of support in terms of their infrastructure, I know they've had technology troubles in the past with outdated servers and stuff like that, trying to keep up with stuff. I know they've had a lot of different types of outages and stuff, but I feel as though that they should have some sort of app, which I think is a common theme across most of the weather community, at least that I see online.
Absolutely. Definitely should be more transparent with their material. I mean, that's probably sort of the dynamic between the private sector and the public sector. Like, the private sector is supposed to, broadcast the data in a more consumer-friendly action, and the National Weather Service is supposed to just provide that. I'm not sure. I'm not going to get political here.
That makes sense. I mean, I guess it's not really political, but I feel as though that, you get great stuff from your local TV stations, but I feel like, especially with what happened with Ida this past year, it was a well forecasted event in terms of that there was going to be a significant flash flooding event in the tri-state area of Connecticut, New York City, Northern Jersey. It was pretty well forecasted in advance. National Weather Service did a great job of kind of outlining the threat that was going to take place. There was a high risk for flooding, which is the highest level they go on their flooding chart.
Yeah, the Weather Prediction Center really
they nailed
out.
it.
Yeah, absolutely.
They nailed it, and the local governments quickly said that this hit without warning, which is completely not true. And I think there needs to be a much better communication between the National Weather Service and the public in general, because that's their main priority. I know they issue tornado warnings and stuff like that, but I feel as though that threats like this should be well communicated in advance.
Absolutely. Any sort of middleman in general is gonna pose a risk of error in communication.
Right.
No matter what.
Yeah, and it's I feel as though that I don't know if I have all the answers in terms of how to actually make that happen, but someone should figure out a way to make it work. I feel like we went on a pretty big tangent there because we were talking about our first chase together, and we were talking about the Storm Prediction Center.
Yeah, it's okay, so effective May 15th.
Yeah. May 15th. We were chasing in northwestern Connecticut. Like I said earlier, it was a very high risk event in the Northeast. It's not often that we get moderate risk days up here in the Northeast. I think that was the last one we chased, if I'm not mistaken.
Has there been any other moderates since?
In the Northeast?
Yeah.
Not off the top of my head that I can think of, but maybe one towards maybe Western Pennsylvania or Ohio maybe. But beyond that, pretty kind of out far for a day chase kind of situation for us at least. But nonetheless, moderate risk day. I know there was one about a week earlier in upstate New York. May 7th, 2018, there was a moderate risk, wind-driven moderate risk, if I'm not mistaken.
I believe so.
It was maybe about a week or so prior, maybe 10 days prior to May 15th. Because I know May 15th ultimately overshadowed that other event because it, I think, affected a much less populated area. But May 15th basically went on to be a tornado outbreak in the Northeast, essentially, with multiple confirmed tornadoes, albeit they were weak, fortunately. But there were still straight-line winds that ended up causing fatalities. So it was a pretty significant event here in the Northeast, and we were on it. And it was Connor's first time manning the chase vehicle, which was none other than his Nissan Maxima.
Yeah, my rather low profile yet extremely wide and bulky sedan.
Yeah, which led to problems because that thing does not have a great turning radius.
Oh, it is absolutely awful. It's oof.
Yeah, which was nice because this year was the first year that we had a new chase vehicle, which is my 2019 Subaru Crosstrek, which that thing is quite the little tank, a little storm tank, I'd say.
Yeah.
It's got nice ground clearance, all-wheel drive, manual transmission, so you can really control the torque at the wheels, especially on those mud dirt roads out there in the plains. And it has a way better turning radius than that of your Maxima, which ended up being somewhat of a problem when we were chasing. So the event started with discrete supercells, as you remember, but we found ourselves in a pretty sticky situation that I detailed in the first episode, but I want to hear your perspective in terms of what happened. So we were near Winsted, Connecticut.
Yep.
And where we were, there was the only road that we had was a north-south option, and we were caught in the notch.
Yes.
And the notch of the supercell is to the north of you, generally speaking, if you have a traditional supercell that's moving, east or northeast. These supercells this day were moving directly east. To the north of you, you have your precipitation core, which usually contains large hail, blinding rain, and the forward flank of the storm. So pretty significant straight line winds. To the south of you, in the notch, is your mesocyclone and updraft base, where you have a rear flanking downdraft, so more significant straight line winds. And
your tornado.
Yeah, if the storm has a tornado. And in our case, this storm was primed and ready to drop a tornado.
Yeah, basically. And of course, if you've caught up on any severe weather safety video at all, especially Skip Talbot's video, you assume that any supercell with that structure has a tornado, especially if you can't get a visual gauge on it. So
that's a great point in terms of, chaser safety. Just assume that a tornado is on the ground or is imminent. So you got to treat that area under the updraft base very cautiously. So we had this north-south road option, and we could either go south and cross the path of this mesocyclone with this updraft base, or go north to the hail core. Because where we were wasn't an ideal spot if this thing decided to do a more northern shift, which supercells can easily do, even though these ones have a pretty solid track. When you have a tornado on the ground and it occludes, usually a lot of the time you'll have some sort of northern motion as the tornado and the supercell kind of wraps up the tornado. It kind of concludes and it gets kind of absorbed into the rest of the storm, and it usually kind of takes that last left turn on its dying stages. If you've looked at any tornado swath pictures before, you'll kind of notice that they'll start off in one trajectory, and by the end of their life cycle, they'll take a left turn and kind of dissipate. So where we were, if there was a tornado on the ground at that point and it decided to, reach the ending stages of his life, or even during its life, it could possibly, take that sudden track towards us. So it was not a good situation to be in. And what do you remember in that moment?
I remember, first off, it was a pine forest of just absolute, 100-foot tall pine trees, just either side, just absolutely canceling out your vision, which is a given in the Northeast, considering that it's a giant forest, the Northeast is.
Yeah, and at this time, too, that we hadn't had our practices really figured out yet. It wasn't until later that season that we really started kind of figuring out a good rhythm and trying to find more open areas to see our storms.
Absolutely. Of course, this was my first chase, so I had no idea what I was doing.
Yeah. Unfortunately, it wasn't my first rodeo, but I think this was the first time that I really was dealing with proper supercells. Beefy, classic supercell structure on radar. There's no mistaking it's a supercell. Sometimes in the Northeast you get supercells, but they're mini supercells essentially. You get these warm season supercells, not your typical almost dry line style supercells that you get out in the plains. You get these, warm sector supercells basically, so ahead of the cold front that they're on. So basically, we were dealing with something that was kind of outside of what we had already what we've experienced before. And this is Connor's first experience at chasing, and here we are, moderate risk day, and we're just kind of in a sticky situation with no visibility in terms of being able to identify storm structure. So a really bad situation in terms of chasing. And hindsight is obviously 2020, but it was not the place that we should have been.
Yeah, because considering that once we took one bend and we were able to finally gauge that the storm, we were able to see just absolutely whirling winds just going to the right, I believe.
Yeah, because we were north of it, and we looked to our south. We were originally heading south because the way this road was, it was kind of like a T-junction road that we got onto this north-south option via this kind of T-junction. And we had gone south a couple miles to kind of get south of the storm so we could look up north at it. Because I think a lot of the problems with northeast chasing is that you're not dealing with a traditional grid network road that you would see in the plains. The roads conform to where town centers are, which usually has to depend on terrain features. So roads are not a guarantee. They kind of just zigzag all over the place.
They're very windy and bendy.
Yeah, and in northwestern Connecticut, where there's no visibility, it led to us being in the situation where we've gone a couple miles down this north-south road, and we're looking south, and all of a sudden we're seeing, blinding walls of rain coming from the right and then coming back left. And it was like a sudden, we could see the surge of rain coming right and then coming back left, which is obvious for an RFD cut. This thing is surging in a circular rotation, and this storm ultimately produced the Winsted, Connecticut EF1 tornado. Caused some damage to houses and stuff, but ultimately, I don't believe there were any injuries with this tornado. But nonetheless, if we were to have continued on this south option, we would have been blasting through what is called the bear cage, which is a term to describe the updraft base within a storm. And when it's precipitating and it's getting into this rear flanking downdraft that wraps around where a tornado would be, it basically creates a cage of rain. And inside that bear's cage is your bear or
your tornado.
Exactly.
I have a feeling that's going to be a reoccurring theme here. I'm just going to keep saying your tornado.
Yeah. So, then, do you remember what happened after that?
Basically, we took that Maxima and absolutely cranked that turning radius as much as it can go, which was not a lot. So we had to perform a 7-point turn.
I don't think it was quite a 7-point turn.
5-point.
Yeah, it was enough of it was definitely more than a K turn though, on this pretty small road, and not an ideal situation like we said. I remember taking the turn, and the worst part about this is that I had my camera on the floor. I had my Canon T5i rolling, and it's just on the floor, and I think we said that we need to get out of here, and then it was dead silence after that, and then you just hear the engine roaring, because we were just blasting north because we just were not in a good situation. I think we both identified that we were not in a good spot, even though Connor...
I am not an atmospheric scientist, nor I was an atmospheric scientist.
But we both I kind of knew what was going on. I don't think Connor realized as much what was going on, but we both instinctively kind of knew that we were not in a good place.
There was your tornado there.
Yeah. So we blast north on this road, and we're just trying to get out of the way as soon as possible. And things calm down for maybe 30 seconds, and then things pick back up immediately again. And what were we greeted by coming out of that clearing?
Hail. Lots and lots of hail.
Yeah, so we pulled off the road, and then we were getting assaulted by golf ball size hail. So probably about quarter to golf ball size hail.
Yeah, most likely.
I mean, there are definitely some golf balls in there, maybe even a little bit larger than that, which was quite alarming because I had never seen hail that large in the Northeast before.
Yeah.
Actually, that's not entirely true. June 1st, 2011.
There was quarter size to golf ball size.
Yeah, no, I think there was hail reported of upwards of like 3 inches in some places, but not around where we were. But we saw probably the golf ball size hail because I grabbed some from outside and put them in the freezer.
Yeah.
And I had them for a good period of time before some of them melted. But yeah, it was crazy to kind of experience, plains level hail for the first time. And we're in Connor's 2004 Maxima getting assaulted with this hail, and it's incredibly loud. For anyone that hasn't been in a car being hit by hail, it's almost deafening to a point when it's like obliterating your car at significant velocity.
Especially when you're in the forward flank and it's
like wind driven.
Yeah, it's wind driven. You're going to have additional velocity on it, so
yeah.
There's going to be more force.
Yeah. So we definitely had our fair share of excitement in that moment. And I don't even know, I can't even recall the rest of that chase really. I think after the hail, we just kind of called it and went home.
Yeah.
Which, well, sometimes you had your brush with, the storm, I guess, and you have to kind of just move on.
Yeah. You just have that fight or flight response, and you're not fighting a tornado.
Right. And since that day, Connor and I have gotten really good at vocalizing and communicating to each other, which is something that I think is possibly one of the best parts of chasing with someone and someone that you are familiar with. Because Connor and I, we have obviously we're brothers, so we have quite the chemistry. We have a team, storm chasing team chemistry, whatever you want to call it. And we just kind of have phrases and stuff that we throw at each other, and we all know what we're just on the same wavelength, essentially.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
We have a dynamic.
We do have a dynamic. What would you say is the biggest part of our, kind of chasing chemistry?
That's a toughie because just basically just being in a team in general, just
I feel at least between us, especially because we're brothers, it's almost instinctual.
Yeah.
I feel like we've known each other so long that we can kind of just read each other without having to actually even vocalize anything.
True.
And the other thing is that Connor is taking care of the driving while I'm taking care of everything else. And as I've mentioned before on this podcast, I think that having someone that you can just dedicate to just straight driving and driving responsibilities is possibly the best thing you can do in chasing, because the number one safety factor when it comes to storm chasing is dealing with the road. The road is a really dangerous place, especially with other drivers out there. You're doing, how many hundreds, thousands of miles in a given chase trip, and it all adds up. And if you don't have someone that's attentive behind the wheel, or if you're in a chase, there's been a number of chaser accidents before just because the driver was distracted, essentially. It's a really important thing, I believe, to have someone that's dedicated to doing the driving side of the chase.
Absolutely. Some of those chaser accidents have proven to be fatal, and you can hear with every, basically storm chaser on YouTube or basically in the social platform, basically just driving is the most difficult part of being a chaser.
Right. So it's important to have someone that's sole task, in my personal opinion, is to drive. And that's what Connor brings to the team, and he has gotten very good at it, I might add. I think I've said this a lot to you personally, but I want it on the record publicly that you are one of the best drivers in terms of, getting through precipitation and anything along the lines of that.
I have a feeling a couple of chasers are going to start attacking us for that. They're going to turn that into fighting words.
Yeah, because that you're the best driver?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, like I said before, it also comes down to our chemistry.
True.
We know each other. We've gotten to a point where sometimes, we'll come to an intersection, and Connor will only look left, and I'll look right, and we'll both be like, good. We kind of do almost like a pilot check thing. You know how when pilots are doing their pre-flight checklist, they vocalize everything.
Yeah.
So they just to like go through the list, and if the pilot or the co-pilot picks up on anything wrong, they kind of, they can correct each other. It's like the same thing where it's essentially like an airplane cockpit. We treat that situation where, we're both paying attention to our surroundings and kind of checking each other, which is huge, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Being able to either correct your mistakes or just being able to... I've lost my train of thought.
Yeah. I mean, once again, chaser chemistry is something that I think a lot of people should kind of look into. If you chase alone, I highly suggest bringing someone that maybe is into storms. Maybe you'll make them into a chaser too, or maybe a good chaser that you know. Consider tagging along with each other for a drive, for a chase, and seeing how it goes, because I think it has forever changed how I chase. And I know that I'm not distracted driving, and I'm putting my full attention into the forecast and all that without splitting my attention, and Connor can just focus on the driving aspect of things and kind of getting us around where we need to be and doing it so in the safest manner possible.
Yeah, being able to diverge those abilities like that,
right.
Absolutely important. And especially on a long drive as well, where even if you're not chasing in general, just taking the long trips to places or wherever, having a second driver so you don't get tired is extremely important, considering that we're Northeast chasers that have to get down to the plains for your chase.
Yeah. Do you want to tell the story of what we did this past year?
Oh, which one?
How we got down there?
Oh, yeah, just the absolute
slog of a drive that we did.
The complete migration of a drive that we had. Just the all-nighters that we took, and
yeah.
I mean, we didn't have to pull all-nighters because
at least on the way back we didn't have to.
Oh yeah,
but we did. So, do you want to tell us how do we get down there, Connor?
Basically,
I feel like I'm doing a lot of talking here. I need you to chip in a little
all right.
bit. So, we left here on May 16th, early afternoon.
Yeah, like 2 p.m.
Yep.
And basically what we all did but the two of us did was just take 3-hour shifts. Basically just like one of us drives for 3 hours and we go on the interstate, just completely going at it. And once our 3-hour limit was up or we felt tired, we just pull over at the nearest rest stop. We just do a quick change, maybe get some gas, and then just set on off again.
And we did this all the way to
just outside Amarillo.
Yep. Until we started chasing.
Yeah.
Which was a slog and a half. I think it took us around 27, 28 hours to do it straight.
Yep.
And we weren't originally planning to do that until we got to about Erie, Pennsylvania, and the Storm Prediction Center upgraded to a moderate on the day 2.
Yeah.
And we were like, okay, we have to make it to Lubbock, Texas. And we tried our darndest to get down there in time for the Lubbock storm, which ended up being like the storm of the day, that Lubbock storm. But we couldn't get quite there in time. And we caught a nice little supercell just south of Amarillo. And it was a stationary supercell. It did a left split at one point.
Yeah, that
where
was really nice.
Basically the storm kind of has like does like almost like a mitosis kind of thing, and it splits off, and there's 2 storms.
Yeah, there's 2 updrafts basically. One updraft turns into 2 updrafts and has their associated.
Then there's two storms, and yeah, it was pretty cool. And they were mostly stationary. And at that point, after doing 28 hours of solid driving, I had no complaints of dealing with a almost stationary supercell.
Me neither. I was tired.
Yeah, we were pretty beat that day. And I don't think it would have been probably the smartest decision to chase Lubbock that day, especially it was a pretty significant supercell and pretty significant tornado on the ground. So it would have been, maybe not the best situation for someone that was really sleep deprived, or 2 people that were really sleep deprived to be chasing that kind of situation.
Yeah, that wouldn't have been a smart decision. Speaking of not smart decisions, the migration that we took that day to get to our hotel was not fun.
Yeah, what was it? Just like dumping rain?
Yeah, we went through MCS, I believe, but also
when everything went up swale.
Yeah, we went from the Amarillo area to Wichita Falls,
which isn't that far, but we kind of just I don't know why we picked Wichita Falls. I think because there was like a setup out east, and then we were like, oh, like that's gonna be the setup for tomorrow. And then we woke up and like actually like kind of processed what was going on that day, and we're like, what are we talking about? Why are we gonna drive to, the jungle of East Texas for some, leftover MCS, MCV kind of style, whatever. I don't even know what it was. It was like tropical stuff, pretty much. Whereas there was a nice dry line set up over near
the Lubbock area again.
Yeah, Lubbock. It was more south of Lubbock, more like Midland, which ended up being the La Mesa Day, May 18th, which was a real fun chase.
Oh yeah, I mean, I could explain on so many levels how that La Mesa Day was just so fun.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, that was like the first real proper, like, it felt like, oh, we're planes chasing.
Yeah, that was, we're no longer like little boys in the Northeast. We're planes men now.
Yeah, that was awesome, man. It's like we were seeing all these chasers out there, and it was lovely to see all these cool faces that we grew up watching. I mean, I think we saw every chaser that we grew up kind of idolizing out there.
Yeah, well, like we started off seeing Aaron Jack near like the tiny town of Loop, and then we started seeing the team of Talbots, the Simon professors, and Pico's Hank, all in one location.
And Jeff Petrowski, Daniel Shaw later on, I think.
Michael Binsky.
Yeah, because there was a lot of them that were up on the New Mexico target, which was a little bit further north, and then I think they all came down to this other storm. And so we were seeing everyone at that point, and it was just cool to, everyone's waving and honking and as you drive by, and it was just such a, like, communal experience to be had.
So yeah, that made me feel like a real storm chaser. Made me feel like I was actually a part of the weather community.
Yeah, and, later on, once we were up in Colorado too, we got to experience a lot more of like the pre-chase activities where we were meeting with chasers before the storm and getting to have conversations where we could kind of just, get an understanding of what everyone's about. And it was just really cool to chat with a lot of like-minded people that all loved the same thing that you loved, which in the Northeast, there's not many of us up here. I mean, I've had a couple on the podcast already, and there are more that I'll have on in the near future, but in the plains, you're getting people from kind of all over the place. Like we met people from Florida, from Oklahoma, there was one that I met from like the Pacific Northwest. We met people from Kentucky. We met people from Pennsylvania, from Ohio.
From Illinois.
Yeah, it's like you're meeting people from all over the place. It's really, really cool.
And also the real Daniel Shaw.
The real Daniel Shaw.
Ensue clapping.
Yeah. Yeah, and we got to experience Applebee's in the plains in Sydney, Nebraska, and Lubbock, Texas. I think those are the 2 times we went to Applebee's.
Yeah.
So I guess what we're getting at is that it was nice for us to finally experience that plains camaraderie of storm chasing. And I know Connor's looking forward to it, and I've vocalized it plenty already of being back out there next year.
Yeah, I can't wait for May of 2022.
Yeah. So, Connor, dating back a little bit to your younger days, what led you to be fascinated with storms? I know I've shared my story on this podcast in the pilot episode. How about yourself?
I was originally not a weather fan. I've always been interested in STEM, though, so I'm an engineer. I should probably mention that I'm an aerospace engineer and also a computer scientist. But so I've been really interested in STEM and all of the sciences and everything. But storms originally, that's the key word, weren't my biggest fascination.
And if I'm not mistaken, you kind of were afraid. You were kind of a scaredy cat kind of kid.
Oh yeah, I mean, I'm just a naturally anxious person, but yeah, being able to experiencing June 1st was not like you. I was scared beyond belief, and up until I would say around 2015 was I was definitely scared of storms and all that jazz.
Yeah, and I still recall you would also watch Storm Chasers with me when I'd watch it. maybe not as much as obsessive about it as I was.
Yeah, but I have a feeling it was more, once again, of the camaraderie and the people and Tim Samaras being interested in the engineering aspects of it.
Right. Yeah. So how do you feel now that I've kind of incorporated you into this fascination of mine, in the sense that you are now like a part of like this team, June 1st being a team? I mean, it's primarily, I guess, my efforts, but we had the design team this past year with my fellow engineering peers, and now you being a part of the storm chasing side of the team, and eventually you're going to be helping out with the engineering side of things relatively shortly. So how do you feel kind of now being much more assimilated into this?
I'm very fascinated with storms and how they function, and I've also been interested in, once again, kind of in your mission as well. I've been really starting to get fascinated with being able to collect the data and build the sensors to see how all this weather works.
Yeah. I mean, it's pretty crazy, like, what has to be done in order to get these kind of measurements. And your expertise being more of the computer side, you being a lot better programmer than I, and having the extra tailored engineering asset of aerospace. I'm just a pure mechanical guy. I have all the broad picture stuff, whereas Connor is very dialed in terms of fluids and thermo and kind of really understanding how aircraft work.
Yeah, dynamical systems.
Yeah. So I think Connor's going to be a great engineering addition to the team, which this winter we're going to be doing a lot of work to kind of get things ready for May of 2022. And I'm not sure that we'll be doing full-scale deployments in 2022. I think that we'll be maybe doing some demo flights on some storms in 2022. That's where I think. I don't think we're going to be quite ready to deploy, but I think we'll be doing some full-scale testing, and hopefully before the height of chase season, we'll be kind of doing some mock deployments on clear weather days just to kind of get the system kind of flushed out.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, I probably should have said this as well, but I'm also a student right now, a college student. So
yeah, so he's not yet officially an engineer yet, but he's getting there.
Yeah, but also the thing is that I have to divert a lot of my time to getting internships done, to just school in general, which is why I've not been on this podcast yet for a while. It's finally a break, and that's when I'm finally been able to do this podcast.
Well, to be fair, Connor, this podcast has only existed for a month.
That's true. But during that month, I've been very hard at work being a student. So, yeah. And that's going to be sort of a common theme with my storm chasing career for the next year or two. So, but then once 2023 rolls around, I'm finally going to get to graduate and going to be able to make this more of my life.
Yeah. I mean, I would love to make this my full-time career in terms of the engineering side and then doing the deployment side on the field and stuff. Obviously, I'm not anywhere near to being that yet, but I'm hoping that this podcast leads to more doors to be opened. It's another medium to kind of get out there and kind of share the world what we're doing, because there's a lot of meteorologists and a lot of people obsessed with the weather side of things. I don't think there's a lot that really understand the engineering aspect of it, and I feel as though that there needs to be more of that. I think the person that does that the best right now, that does the engineering, is Mark Simpson over at Chase and Spin, who does all the work for Reed's stuff at Team Dominator and what they're doing what they're doing in terms of doing rocket deployments on supercells and tornadoes. So hopefully that we're going to be the ones that are kind of, the next generation. And then this is what I was talking about last week with Thomas Nepshield. And I think that there's going to be a need for engineers to really step up to kind of push the boundaries and then collect the data for meteorologists to kind of process and fully understand what's going on.
As you've said this before, we're going to need a whole bunch of data points, and we're going to need to verify those computer model simulations.
Right.
Because, as any storm chaser would know, models aren't exactly perfect. So
no, I mean, and that's the thing too. It's honestly quite amazing where our computer models are as accurate as they are. I don't feel as though that sometimes gets fully appreciated, especially by the younger generation within the weather community, because I don't think they really understand what it takes to do that kind of level of calculations into that kind of resolution.
Yeah,
and how much computing power that takes alone.
Oh yeah, and I'm obviously not an expert in this. I'm only a minor in computer science, but being able to understand the programming on how these models work, I mean, you're gonna have to analyze each data point that is a kilometer, 3 kilometers wide, and that's going to be spread out throughout the whole entirety of the United States in 3 dimensions.
Yeah,
that's a lot of data points, and so you're gonna have to monitor all of its properties, all of its interactions, all of its
and you get to take into account all of these equations for the physics that's going on and terrain features. Because you got the Great Lakes, for example, which are doing crazy things in terms of providing lake effect weather systems, and you have to take that into account. And it's amazing how that can be used to predict what's going on days in advance and be remotely accurate.
Oh yeah.
Like, what happens in those situations is you get what's called error propagation. So if you put something into the model, for example, and it's not quite right, the more you advance in time, you're basically running a calculation at one time step and then taking that result and using that for the next calculation. So if you start off with a bad number, you're just going to keep getting bad numbers down the chain to the point where they grow to such a large error that it's just going to be wrong. And that's how you get these images of, GFS at 300 something hours, and you're getting a 880 millibar hurricane hitting New England. Yeah, that's how you get those kind of situations. And obviously, something like that, it's not going to happen, but it's because of these error propagations in these models. So you can't take for granted model runs when they're at the limits of their run. So at the GFS, for example, if you're going out more than a week, you're not going to have an accurate picture of what's actually going to happen. Or even the HER, for example, the HRRR, whatever you want to call it. If you're looking at the extreme limits of its capability, in terms of time, if you're looking at the very end of it, it's probably not going to be indicative of what's going to happen actually at that time.
Oh yeah, and you can't really implement a filter system on it. You can't really mitigate that uncertainty propagation. So that's going to be that's basically just going to go unchecked. So
right.
And you can't really trust a model to go any farther than, I don't know, what would you say in your more forecasting experience than I am?
In terms of time?
Yeah.
I mean, it depends on what the resolution is. If it's a short range model, it's only going to be probably valid. You're probably going to have maybe a pretty good idea of what's going on for maybe only a couple hours. So the HER, for example, maybe, 8 to 10 hours is probably something you could probably trust pretty reliably. I'm not sure. I'm not an expert in this either, but that's, in my personal experience, kind of a limit for that, for example.
And how about the 3 kilometer NAM? Is that the same thing? Or the NAM? Or NAM?
3 kilometer NAM is a little bit different because that's more of a mid-range model. I would say maybe 24 hours is probably your upper limit in terms of what you can take probably pretty seriously.
All right.
So that's just in my personal experience. But Connor, you being a computer scientist, you kind of understand how these kind of calculations work, right?
Not exactly. I'm sort of.
I guess you understand how how the programming side works in terms of putting in inputs and then generating outputs.
Yes.
So if you put garbage in, you're gonna get
garbage out.
Exactly. I know that's a pretty common phrase in that sphere. So, I don't know what it would actually take to build your own atmospheric model. I know there's a lot of people out there that do some really good work in that. I know there's like the NATO cast. I'm not sure who exactly runs that. But there are some really good programmers out there in the weather world, and that's honestly the future in terms of meteorology. Thomas was talking about it last week, and he's very much right. I mean, computer models are what we do the majority of our forecasting with up until the nowcast, where we have, surface observations to actually kind of figure out where everything's at. So, and that's where everything starts with too. Your model, like that, you're getting a model run. It's literally starting with what the surface observation stations are giving you. And there's only so many surface observation stations. And with the high res models, there's not enough you're having to interpolate between points. And by interpolating, I mean that you have to kind of guess what's happening between one point and another point. And that, you have weather stations that are at a much coarser resolution than your model's running at. So, obviously you're not going to have a very clear picture of what's going to happen. It just kind of has to. You see what I'm getting at?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm trying to explain this the best I can. Maybe you can do a better job of it than I.
Yeah, and I might geek out here, but basically weather models are basically designed to take a set of initial conditions, which are basically your surface observations, and basically it's trying to, at each time step, which is in some cases, let me repeat that, and it's going to run through different time steps, which is dependent on the model, but
like an hour, 3 hours,
yeah, an
6
hour,
hours, whatever.
Yeah. So basically, and then it's going to run through all of its physics calculations. It's going to do some numerical integration and run through its interactions with different nodes of the system. And it's going to figure out what its next state is going to be.
Right. It's like a nodal analysis for the world in terms of weather.
Yeah, basically, you're going to divide the atmosphere into three-dimensional little segments, and you're going to see how they interact, how their properties change, if they move at all.
It's FEA, but with the sky.
Yeah.
FEA is an engineering term for finite element analysis. It's an acronym. And basically, in engineering, what we do is if we're analyzing, at least in mechanical engineering, I'll use the example because I'm a mechanical engineer, but you have a part and you're trying to figure out, stresses in it, for example. You put a mesh of nodes on it, and that's your elements. You have a bunch of elements in this little part, and then you apply your forces and your constraints, and next thing you know, it's calculating the stresses within this part based on what the material property is. So it's essentially that kind of idea of having a finite number of elements. And obviously, in the real world, there's an infinite number of elements. You integrate everything to the smallest element possible to atoms if we wanted to. But there's no way we can do that with computers. So it's only going to get a rough idea of what's going on.
Yeah, absolutely. And even I'm an aerospace engineer, so you're also applying these finite element analysis to structures, and also in the dynamics, you're applying some numerical integration for courses and how your flight path is going to be. But yeah, you're definitely not going to have an infinite time step, so you aren't going to be stepping through every nanosecond. You're going to be stepping through in the hours, maybe shorter time frames if you want to get your resolution a little bit better. And also, your distance measurement's not going to be perfect either, because you can't model, as you said, you can't model the individual atoms.
You can't put an infinite number of elements. It's physically impossible for computers. Computers cannot calculate infinity.
Yeah.
Basically.
We can do some tricky maths to get around that, but computers cannot.
Yeah.
If you see on the GFS, you can see those those little diamonds. That kind of clicks on my head hey, that's your little element there.
Yeah, that's essentially what it is. You get those diamond shapes of precipitation. That's the grid size you're dealing with, and you're doing a calculation at each of those grid points. So obviously you're not going to get what's going on in the real time, and then obviously it's having to make guesses with the original inputs, and you're stretching those guesses over so long. I I like how we just geeked out about models for like 10 minutes there, but
Yeah,
I think it's a really good point to talk about.
I'm not even sure if
I think it's very much missed in the weather community, especially those that don't understand what's going on when it comes to these computer-aided models.
I'm not even sure if I discussed that right, but yeah, it's
no, you did a great job at it, I think.
Okay.
And there's a great saying, I'll end off this segment on this. There's a great saying by statistician George Box. He was a British statistician, and he said, all models are wrong, but some models are useful. And that's the thing. You can never take a model verbatim.
Yeah, absolutely. In any application whatsoever, whether you're doing RK4 integration for a flight path, or you're doing finite amount analysis for like a structure, or you're running through a weather model, no model, no matter how precise you're going to get it, is perfect. But you're going to have to live with it, because if you're trying to do that on a piece of paper, you're going to want to die.
Yeah, I don't think like you could I'm trying to think how long it would take to do like a GFS kind of style thing by hand. It would probably take years if you're having a single person do it just to run, you'd have to go through every single element and run all the calculations for each element and then take that and just do it again and again and again and again for each time step.
Yeah, and you're going to have to count on how they interact with each other. So you're going to have to be working on like all these at once, and it's not going to be fun for any person.
I think it's physically impossible to do it by hand.
It's
safe to say, without error and losing your mind.
Yeah, losing your mind is going to be a very big one.
Yeah. So, Connor, we're closing in on almost an hour here. So, I'm going to ask you if you have any closing thoughts, and if you have anything that you want to plug in terms of where you're at and where people can find you at.
First off, I'm going to end my closing thought as one of my number one rules: think before you do anything. Just a general piece of advice for anybody out there.
Yeah, I mean that works very well in the chasing community and weather community,
and just
especially and another thing is online presence. I feel like especially what we're seeing on Twitter nowadays in the WX Twitter land, where most of us are kind of active. Just remember that your online digital footprint never goes away. So you just got to be careful about what you say.
Absolutely.
So think before you tweet.
Or do anything.
But yeah. Life advice from Connor.
Yes. But yeah, you can basically find me at any of the June 1st sites, but also my personal Twitter handle at CMoriarty79.
Lovely. Thank you, Connor, for sitting down today.
All right, thank you. I might rebrand that to at CMoriartyWX in the near future. I'm not sure yet, but
I think you're fine as is.
All right.
It's been around for that long.
All right.
So, anyway. So thank you for listening to the June 1st podcast with Connor and I here. Please, once again, check out our socials, and I'll be sure to have you back here at the next episode. Take care.
See ya.